So I wanted to just start by saying a little bit about the origins of the project. Dale was just asking us about, how long did it take you to create this book? So the first meetings regarding this project were back in 2019 at the Korbel School with a bunch of colleagues. And the whole project has been supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So that corporation has always been interested in how do we improve what I call the research to policy interface. That means, how do we make better use of research findings to create higher quality policy and better policy implementation? And with this group of colleagues in 2019, there were probably 12 of us at the original meeting, we agreed on a number of things. One is that we felt like we'd all been very rigorously trained in social science. Secondly, we agreed that we wanted our research to have policy impact, that we want to be relevant to the world. But thirdly, we all also agreed that even though we were extremely well trained in doing research, we were not well trained in how to communicate our findings to policymakers. And if you're sitting there, you're thinking, well, if you have good findings, why doesn't that translate relatively easily into good policy? We have a book for you, because it turns out that it's much more complicated than it seems. For the researcher and for policymakers alike, there are conflicts of interest that arise. There are ethical problems and dilemmas that we'll talk about. There's the misuse of research. There is also, unfortunately, research misconduct on the part of researchers. So that is really where the project begins. And we're going to start off by giving you a couple of examples about the ethical dilemmas that come up for researchers as they choose their questions and engage in policy processes.
Well put. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thanks also to the Vail Symposium and the staff. And it's good to see some familiar faces in the audience. I also just want to give a quick shout out. I think some family members of mine might be watching online. So hello to California. And to those of you in the audience, I hope you got some spring skiing in today. I'd like to start off with one of the examples that we used to start the book off, which is the case of the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. And we thought that while this is a very common example, it's also one that, for that reason, should be accessible to a lot of readers. And so we thought this is a good way to introduce the topic. And really the idea here is to go back to 1945 and think about the dilemmas that the physicists who were developing the bomb were facing. And we have the examples of Oppenheimer and another physicist named Joseph Rotblat. And these two physicists were dealing with a lot of the ethical implications of developing this massively powerful weapon. For Oppenheimer, he was haunted for the rest of his life in terms of the impact that the bomb had, although he led and continued with the project. By contrast, we found that Joseph Rotblat, another physicist, decided to withdraw from the project because of the ethical concerns. And while both of them continued to advocate for nuclear nonproliferation throughout their lives, Rotblat ended up winning the Nobel Prize for his efforts. And we introduced these examples because these two physicists and the whole team of scientists did not really have ethical guidance at that time in terms of how to deal with these issues. And today, social scientists like us, other scientists, we're not dealing with the same issue of developing something as powerful as the bomb, but we're in our day-to-day research developing projects that have public implications, political implications, and we need to think very carefully about how to share those types of findings. And so the book is really the kind of guidance that we think that those types of physicists and other researchers in the early days wish that they had. And so that's how we developed the book.
Great. So we would acknowledge that the Manhattan Project was a long time ago. It's also a very severe example, and you can imagine the ethical dilemmas that the people involved there had. But what we also want to emphasize is that the ethical dilemmas, the misuse of research, the cherry-picking of findings is actually a daily phenomenon. And this headline appeared probably only 3 days ago. And the author is an economist at the University of Chicago whose name is Brent Nyman. And maybe some of you have read his article, but essentially what he tells us is that the formula that the Trump administration recently used in order to determine what level of tariff would be reciprocal tariff was a misapplication of a formula that he presented in a research paper that he had published with colleagues 3 years prior. Right, so the point of this is to say that even if we start with the Manhattan Project and a very extreme example of ethical dilemmas, there continues to be, on a daily basis, if you are alerted to the issue of the misuse of research or research misconduct among social science researchers or others, you become aware of how infused our political discourse is with how and under what conditions we use research. So in Nyman's case, he, fortunately for him, when his research was misused, had access to the New York Times opinion page, right? Not all of us have that much access, right? So it remains a bit of an ethical dilemma for the rest of us. If we see our research that we've put out there with a certain kind of intention and findings, what should our response be if we find that people are misusing it? I mean, obviously, we need to speak out and clarify and make clear what's correct and what's incorrect use. But I do want to highlight at the outset that for many of us, getting the profile that one needs in order to be accurate and transparent and correct is sometimes not that easy.
So I'd like to transition to a more popular culture reference. This is a meme from the movie Jurassic Park. And this is showing the actor Jeffrey Goldblum, who plays the character, the scientist Ian Malcolm. And the quote says, "You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should." And of course, we know what happens in Jurassic Park. The dinosaurs get loose. It's a big problem. And so, oftentimes as scholars, one of our biggest dreams is that someone will actually pay attention to our research and maybe put it to good use. But we're not always thinking about, well, what issues could come up? Is that always a good idea? And so I think, one of the main messages of the book is that we're trying to encourage researchers to think earlier on, maybe as they're designing their research, as they're conducting their research, and then at the stage of sharing their research, what ethical issues might arise and how might they address them early on. And so Jurassic Park is actually a good reference point for that. And similarly, another graphic that we kind of made modifying this common book that you might see in the bookstore, the worst case scenario survival handbook. We kind of made a bit of a joke edition here that is the version for bridging the gap between scientists and researchers and policymakers and decision makers. So really encouraging us to think about what could go wrong. What's the worst case scenario? And I can tell you, just this week I'm running some applied projects with students in my human rights classes, and we had this very discussion. What are the possible worst things that could go wrong with our research for different parties involved? What would be the worst thing in terms of a policy outcome? What would be the worst thing for a university or for a researcher or for a student involved? And trying to think about all of these things ahead of time so that we can prepare. And then similarly, we also want to think about what could go right. What are the best case scenarios and how can we make sure that those come about? So really we think about like the term in political science that we use for interacting with a policy audience is bridging the gap between the ivory tower and the House of Congress or the policymakers perch in Washington or wherever they may be.
Yeah, and in that respect, the book is also making the case that we really need science for policy, right? This is a book that is very attached to the idea that we need evidence-based policy making. And furthermore, that science and scientific communities have a really critical role to play in a functioning and high-quality democracy. And there are a couple components here that I would emphasize at this juncture. One is that for sound policymaking, we need scientific evidence. But second, the creators of that knowledge, I think, have to be perceived as being independent in order to have credibility with publics. And then the third thing I would say about quality of democracy and the role of science is that there has to be a way to hold political leaders accountable. And one way to do that is to compare their policies against what evidence suggests would be sound policy. And in the event that they stray from sound scientific evidence, having independent scientific communities and findings helps you hold those actors accountable. So the book is also making the case, as difficult as it might be, to engage in policy responsibly. We, as researchers, scientific communities, we have an ethical obligation to make this relationship between research and policymaking as sound, as transparent, and as democratic as possible. And I will say further, one theme that comes up again and again throughout the book, and that colleagues and Ollie and I agreed was really important, was trying to understand what we call here the policy black box. So as researchers begin to engage in a policy process or start advising a policymaker on their findings, it's really important for us to ask a series of questions, including, at what point in the decision-making process are these policymakers? Are they coming to me because they know I've done research which affirms a political prior that they held? Are they in the discovery phase, rather, where they're actually trying to formulate policy? Can I contribute to the formulation of policy? Is there a risk with this particular policy actor that they will take my findings and distort them? Or will they take my research and oversimplify what I'm trying to say in ways that speaks to their political ambition, but doesn't really speak to the accuracy of what I had found? Right? So unlocking that policy black box and being inquisitive about the policy process, the people who are running it, the point at which they are in the implementation, that turns out to be critical. We have a number of good examples coming up for you about the failure, as Ollie was just talking about, of academics to really explore the policy process, in part because, as Ollie also mentioned, researchers are really eager to get their findings out there, right? So I think there's a temptation to be less inquisitive than we need to be in order to get the bottom, if we can, to get to the bottom of what's in that black box of policymaking.
Yeah, I'm trying to get some feedback from policy audiences on how they might be thinking about evidence. So one other analogy that we have in the book is a modified version of Van Gogh's Starry Night painting that you might be familiar with. It has a few little people there in caps and gowns to represent scholars, graduates. And then you see someone at a podium, that's the policymaker, the decision maker there. And what this shows really in the middle there is this two-way arrow going back and forth between the policymaker and the different scholars or researchers. They could be in a university, could be in a think tank, could even be researchers in a government institution. And what you can see here is that some of the different researchers or scholars are looking at different parts of the painting. So some are looking at the dark night, some are looking at the bright moon. And so this really sums up some of the dilemmas that we face, because different researchers might focus on sort of the negative or less rosy picture. Some might focus on the very rosy picture, the bright moon. And that might be what ends up getting shared. So researchers might have their own biases to only share certain types of information that support their research agenda. That's an ethical issue. But there's also an issue where a policymaker might select what type of information they want to hear. So they might only contact some researchers that share their point of view or that justify what they want to say and ignore others. And so in that case, they may cherry pick which findings they want to use. So that's a big problem. They pick the evidence that fits their agenda, maybe not the best evidence out there. They may also identify scholars who are saying what they want to say just so they can sort of check the box to say that they consulted a scholar and that therefore their policy recommendation or decision has more support. So they're sort of using the researcher in that sense. And so really, the issue here is on both sides to understand these dynamics of possible misuse. And so for the researchers, really the issue comes up that they could be stealth advocates. So they could maybe presenting a certain view that they really care about, but maybe isn't what science justifies or is supported by science. So with that, I'd like to jump into the sort of core content of the book. And so we've shown you the framework, and now what we'd like to do is go over the 6 core researcher dilemmas that we identify that researchers confront when they're trying to share science. And so these are each the chapters by different contributors, and we'll just go through them briefly to give you an idea of the types of dilemmas and problems that we're encountering, and we also develop advice for each one. And so the first one is the issue of seduction and red lines. No, not that kind of seduction, but the type of seduction where researchers may be getting benefits by engaging with policymakers or people outside of the ivory tower. And so researchers might be able to get data, they might be able to elevate their profile, they may be able to get funding, other types of access from relationships with policymakers. And this can create a seduction to try to produce research or share things with them in a way that is best for the policymaker as opposed to maybe being fully grounded in science. So it creates this ethical temptation to violate one's ethical standards. And the issue here that comes up is really maintaining one's ethical red lines. And so the example that we have is a chapter written by Professor Jay Lyle. He's a professor at Dartmouth University, Dartmouth College. And he has done some research in Afghanistan during the Afghan conflict over a number of years. In particular, working with, engaged with, in some cases embedded with the US military and NATO. He conducted a lot of research about airstrikes and what are the effects of airstrikes on local populations. Does harm diminish popular support? Are there ways to maintain popular support? And the issue here was that he was, in a sense, worried about being seduced by getting access to raise his profile, to get better data. And so he had to make some difficult decisions. One of them was whether or not to share very detailed information about airstrikes with military actors or not. And he decided that he didn't want to be part of that process where he might have some responsibility in harm that might come to civilians. And so his solution was to set some red lines for himself as a researcher, share those with other people, to try to be mindful of when he was tempted of jumping across those red lines. And so one of the things he did is, instead of sharing very detailed information about a particular airstrike and what might happen, he only shared a very general model of the average effect of how airstrikes might affect popular sentiment on the ground.
I just want to add, with respect to Jay, because he's a great scholar, I mean, his remedy has been to encourage people working in conflict settings to publish their ethical red lines, make them public, and consult with others as a solution to this problem, right? There's some sense in which academics, researchers, we also have to create channels for ourselves, in some cases, of accountability to make sure that if we have a sense of what we consider ethical versus not ethical, that when we go into the field, we're sticking to what we originally thought. I think the risk for somebody like Jay, many other researchers being embedded in something like the US military overseas, is there's this normalization of unethical behavior. That can happen. Jay's argument in the chapter is partly that if you make it clear to your colleagues ahead of time and you publish your limits, you are much less likely to dishonor your own limits when you are confronted. I mean, I think what comes up again and again in these chapters, our researchers face enormous uncomfortable social pressure, which brings me to Tricia Olson's chapter, which I'll talk about next. So this is the issue of unpopular findings. So what happens to us as researchers a lot is you have a funder, could be the government, could be a corporation, a foundation, and they want you to do research, and they're hoping that you're going to come across a certain finding, and you don't, right? And then you have this sort of uncomfortable job of telling them, sorry, but your instrument isn't working the way you thought it would, right? And this is the subject of Tricia Olson's chapter. You can move to the next slide. So Tricia Olson, great colleague, she actually used to teach at Daniels in the business school, but she's trained as a political scientist. She, in the meantime, has taken a job at the University of Minnesota. We are delighted for her, but we also miss her. But the subject of her chapter on unpopular findings and having to present them comes from several years ago. She was asked by the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights to create a database of businesses and their human rights record. And they said, that the objective was to test the guiding principles on business and human rights that the UN was working with to, in their words, this is what they said to her at the outset when they asked her, we would like you to be able to show that our guiding principles on business and human rights are working, right? They said this to Tricia. And Tricia, this is the very beginning of this process, says, well, whether the instrument is actually improving businesses' human rights record all over the world, it's an empirical question. This is what academics always are saying. It's an empirical question. We're gonna go find the answer to this empirical question, right? And I think at that point, Tricia and her co-researcher, they were delighted to have been asked, going back to the fact that we all love to be asked to do research and share our findings. And she didn't really probe more deeply into where they were in this policy process, going back to the black box. So she and her co-author go about collecting this database. The research, I think, was primarily at that time in Latin America. In the meantime, the database is posted. It's publicly available. It's excellent. They've created a lot of great research. But, the downside was, in fact, when they got into this project, they did not find any discernible difference with firms and countries that were engaged in the guiding principles versus not. So Tricia, in her, lovely naivete and a scientific optimism, went to present the findings to the UN working group. And she thought they were going to be fascinated and, concerned and eager to change what they were doing to become more effective, right? The objective is to, make sure that businesses are not abusing human rights in the field and to provide remedies to victims of human rights abuses that encounter this vis-a-vis businesses, now that this was working. So, she was very optimistic and thinking, oh, these people are going to be delighted that we came with these findings. So she goes into the room, she makes this presentation, it's just silence. Nobody has any questions. People are looking at their phones. There's no follow-up. And she's mortified, right? I mean, they've done all this work. The UN is the sponsor of this research, not the funder, but the sponsor. And she's put, again, going back to social pressure that we can sometimes encounter, she put in this terribly awkward situation of only learning after the fact. The guiding principles are already in place. These people are not considering changing anything that they're doing. The process is already underway. Implementation has happened, right? So by the time Tricia has done this research and is presenting this, it's too late, right? And that is not a situation any researcher wants to find themselves in. You don't want to have just been a tool of somebody's, foregone conclusion or, secret agenda, basically. So, I mean, whatever, Tricia's fine. She dusted herself off and went off and did a bunch of great research and published it as a consequence of that encounter, but it does lead her to advise all of us to be, as I said at the beginning, much more inquisitive. Where are they in the policy process? Who are my interlocutors here? What are their interests? What are the ways in which my interests and their interests are not aligned? Can I figure that out at the beginning before I go off and do this enormous research task on behalf of these people?
So another dilemma that comes up is the issue of competing results. And so this is where different researchers studying the same issue come up with different findings. And sometimes they show one thing, sometimes they show another thing. There's not a clear consensus in the academic literature, in the body of knowledge. And so this creates a dilemma in terms of what type of evidence should policymakers use when they're trying to solve a very specific instance or problem that they're looking at. And so this is analyzed by our colleague also at the Korbel School, Professor Tim Sisk, who's an expert on peace processes and peace agreements. And so he's done a lot of research on the topic of what's called post-conflict power sharing. And this is generally the idea that different warring parties, after the conflict has sort of died down a bit and are trying to reach a peace agreement, they need to come up with a way to share power so that there's a sustainable peace, so that conflict doesn't break out again. And this is particularly prominent in cases of interethnic conflict. And so he references an example from Kenya from 2007, 2008. There was a conflict in the Rift Valley area between two different ethnic groups. And former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan went to help mediate this, this conflict, and they arrived at a power sharing agreement to help share power. And one of the issues that Tim identifies is that there are different types of power sharing agreements, and it's not always clear which ones are effective and where. And so he raises the issue that when there's a discrepancy or competing findings in the literature, this can allow policymakers to say, well, I don't really know what the right answer is, so I'm just going to go with my gut or the solution that I want to implement. And so it gives the policymakers almost too much of a free hand. And so what he argues is that researchers should actually do more to try to identify which types of results or findings apply to which cases, and give more concrete advice to decision makers so that they can apply the right findings to the right circumstance. So maybe the right power sharing formula for one country and a different one for another one. In that way, you can avoid the dilemma of competing findings and have policymakers make better policy.
Yeah.
Okay, so another issue is partnered briefings. And so this is an instance where researchers and practitioners may come together to share results with decision makers. And so this could be people within a bureaucracy and a researcher, a scholar, a think tank scholar, or an academic scholar. It could be activists, civil society members, and researchers who have done research together. How do they share research effectively and also ethically, considering the different positions and power asymmetries that might exist between a scholar and a member of civil society, an activist, and such? And so this topic comes up in the chapter by Oliver Kaplan. Fantastic chapter. And in this case, I went to Washington, D.C. for some briefings on how to prevent atrocities, and especially community-based atrocities prevention. And I was invited to participate by a group called Peace Direct. It was a project actually supported by the U.S. Institute of Peace. And they said, would you like to write about what you know about local atrocity prevention? I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I'd like to invite a local activist from Colombia to come with me so that we can share findings together, because I'm a researcher, but they know the conditions on the ground. And so together, a woman named Cristina Serna and I went to Washington to brief different types of policy audiences. At a series of dinners, there were people from the U.S. government, from NGOs, from other types of organizations, think tanks, and we were there with some other local peace builders as well. And what we encountered, and I didn't really realize this till after the fact, but she being an Afro-Colombian woman, me being a white male researcher with a PhD, we come from very different places. And so it became a real issue of am I going to be speaking over her? Am I elevating her in the correct way? What do I bring to the table? What does she bring to the table? So I really had to think through this to both be effective as we shared the findings together, and also make sure that, each of us were, being ethically responsible, and that she was getting her due say. And so just to give a little bit of detail about her community, it's one of the communities I studied in my prior book, Resisting War, and it's really an incredible thing that this community pulled off. So in north central Colombia in the late 70s all the way through the early 90s, her community was basically targeted by a bunch of different armed groups, guerrilla groups such as the FARC, which you might have heard about. They signed a peace agreement in 2016, but they were also caught between paramilitary groups, which were somewhat aligned with the government, as well as military forces. And so the question for them was, what do they do? Do they stay in place? Do they displace? Do they leave? Do they align with one group or another? And what they did is they basically rejected all those options. They came up with their own local peace solution, and they decided to mount a nonviolent organization called the Peasant Workers Association of the Carrara River region. By the initials, it goes by ATCC. in the Spanish initials, longer in English. And so what they did is they developed a process to mediate local disputes between neighbors and threats that might come from armed groups to try to tamp down violence and make sure that it wasn't armed groups who were resolving those kinds of conflicts with armed force. Instead, they were mediated and people could go about their business safely. It was very effective, and that was this perspective that she was able to bring to the table and tell sort of her personal story in a way that, as a researcher, I could provide some different types of evidence, but I didn't have that lived experience that she did. And I think the kind of summary is that, the academic scholarship with, more rigorous findings, data, more careful comparisons, combined with that local voice are very effective, but they have, also challenges that have to be balanced out.
Great. Okay, so in the last two case studies that we present, there's a bit of a shift, I would say, in the focus. The two chapters I'm going to talk about next are George DiMartino's and my own. This is about pro-social lying. So the emphasis in this part of the book is really on what goes wrong within our academic disciplines that compromises the quality of the policy advice that we're providing. So George DiMartino is a fabulous economist who's also working at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, right? So he's a critic of the economics field coming from within it, which to me is much more persuasive than if I critique the economics field. Okay, so George, you can move to the next slide, is interested in this idea of pro-social lying. And I know that earlier in this series, maybe some of you were here, you had some experts come in and talk about the consequences and maybe the unfolding of the 2008 financial crisis. So what George is arguing in his chapter is that within the econ profession, because economists trained at a high level are so confident in their own knowledge and understanding, there's a kind of hubris that develops and a sense that, a patronizing sense vis-a-vis the public, that you need to tell the public only as much as the public needs to know to not destroy markets themselves through their herd behavior, right? The way that this argument unfolds vis-a-vis the 2008 financial crisis, according to George, Ben Bernanke, who of course was the US federal chair at the time, knew as the crisis was unfolding in the spring and certainly the summer, and then certainly by the fall of 2008, the closer we got to crisis, the more reassuring and calm, and in George's view, deceptive Bernanke's comments became. Right, so George has a series of quotations from Bernanke over time, starting in the spring of 2008. And remember, in the spring of 2008, Bear Stearns had already collapsed in March. And interestingly, if you look at some of the statements from Bernanke in May of that year, he's quite alarmed. By the time you get to June, he's essentially saying, we're very confident at this point that our policy measures are going to support moderate growth and financial stability for the foreseeable future. So, of course, we cannot definitively prove that Bernanke was purposefully, intentionally lying. But George knows the econ profession, knows how folks in that profession operate, how they view publics. George's assertion is that, in fact, Bernanke was engaged in pro-social lying, pro-social meaning that Bernanke believed in a sort of patronizing way that he was helping the American public and maybe publics beyond by discouraging the kind of panic selling or other kind of market activity that would make the financial crisis worse. I think George's view of this is that it's problematic in two ways. That if the econ profession, and I think from current debate about economic policy, we can agree the econ profession is in something of a crisis, right? The problem with pretending that there aren't really serious problems unfolding before you as a policymaker like Bernanke, you do over time undermine public confidence in your expertise. That's one problem. The other problem, which I think from a philosophical point of view, also very interesting, going back to the idea of patronizing economists trying to guide public behavior, George is very firm on the idea that this really compromises the autonomy and the dignity of the listening public. And on those grounds, too, really cautions against pro-social lying by social scientists, even if they think it's helping to mitigate the worst effects of something like a financial crisis. And then, finally, for not the last chapter, but the last case study. So this is about exaggerating results. This is my own chapter.
Some might say the best chapter.
Only you would say it's the best chapter, but thank you, Ollie. Exaggerating results. So this is something, again, like pro-social lying that George is focusing on. As we were formulating the project, I had a very different set of issues in mind, honestly. So as James told you at the outset, I am primarily an expert in Central and Eastern Europe. The Cold War ended, and countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, then Czech Republic and Slovakia were moving towards democratic governance. People like me, in that first book that you mentioned, James, were really optimistic about the trajectory of post-communist Europe, particularly the countries that were joining the European Union and NATO. They were quickly consolidating as full-fledged democracies. The overgeneralization I had at that time was really about the democratic backsliding that was transpiring in Eastern Europe by the time we met in 2019. That was the overgeneralization I was concerned about. Then the world moved on, and at a certain point, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 changed the focus of the chapter more about overgeneralization in terms of NATO and NATO enlargement being a source of Russian aggression. So in this chapter, what I'm doing is essentially, and I know this is going to make it sound tedious, I don't want to deter you from buying the book, but I do go through 30 years of American debate on NATO enlargement. And I think what I want to emphasize is the extent to which that debate, which is critical for public policy, you will find, and I unearth it, all the times that academics are making statements about the effects of NATO enlargement which cannot be linked to evidence, right? Cannot be linked to evidence. And I will say, since I am a NATO enlargement proponent based on my research, that really, and I don't mean to be snarky, but the worst offenses in terms of exaggerated results, overgeneralization, it is on the side of people saying NATO caused Russian aggression. That reasoning, in terms of the evidence, gets the logic exactly backwards. I know that you also had early in your season somebody here talking about the war in Ukraine, and I think it's critically important. What I recommend in terms of how to combat the impulse towards overgeneralization and exaggeration, because people do engage in this, as we said very early on, to get policy traction, to get people's attention. One of the things I suggest is that academics critically review their own work periodically to see where in the past they've exaggerated their results, they've tried to get policy traction, they're making claims that isn't directly tied to evidence. So I made this assertion at a conference recently that Ollie was also at. One of the critics said, literally he said this, nobody's ever going to do that, right? So this gives you a sense of how, not surprisingly, academics are very wedded to this idea that they have to be right? And they're very reluctant to look at their own records critically in order to combat this unfortunate impulse towards exaggerated results. The final thing I'll say on this issue is that unfortunately, the venue in which it comes across most prominently is in the most publicly accessible venues. So these are journals like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. These are very good journals. They have huge audiences. But those journals are also a little bit complicit in this problem of exaggerated results, insofar as that if you're writing for them, they feel very strongly you have a powerful point of view. They're not particular sticklers that you take alternative explanations into account, right? So there's also a problem, I think, in the way that we expect academics to present their findings, which is to be quite strident, quite certain, quite dismissive of possible alternative explanations. This kind of approach, of course, makes it easier for policies to make a clear case to publics, but it is also not embracing the complexity which is necessarily part of our policymaking, decision-making process. So that's another thing that I like to emphasize in conclusion to that chapter.
So in addition to the brilliant researcher contributions, we also have some really interesting and engaging perspectives from practitioners. So facing these dilemmas, how do practitioners deal with these issues, practitioners in action? And so we have perspectives from two particular practitioners. I'm just going to go through those very briefly. One of them is a friend and colleague in Colombia. His name is Cesar Caballero. And in the early 2000s, he was actually the director of the Colombian Census Bureau. And if you've been following politics in the US, you know that the Census Bureau has had some of its own questions come up. And he, as sort of both a policy maker position, practitioner, but also someone in a government position who managed information and generated research, he was sort of on both sides of these issues, both sides of this gap between researchers and policymakers. And so this is a cover of the Colombian magazine Semana, which is kind of like the Newsweek magazine of Colombia, really the most commonly read weekly magazine. And it features a picture of him, and the headline here says, El que es caballero renuncia, which translate to he who is a gentleman resigns. And so caballero is both gentleman and it's his last name, so it's kind of a play on words. And basically at one point, actually at several different points, he had felt pressure to not share the full findings, basically downplay certain negative findings, pressure to show other types of findings from the government, from high up people in the office of the president. And at a certain point, he had to make the difficult decision to give up his job. And I think in this country and around the world, we're seeing policymakers and also scientists making this difficult choice to forego a career or forego an important position of influence and impact by basically adhering to some ethical red lines, basically saying these are lines that we will not cross. I'm not going to go past this place because of pressure. And so he had the very difficult decision to make, and he did that, and I think it's a very exemplary one. He also discusses how at different times he even faced death threats, and so we feel like this is an extreme case, and that if he's someone like under that type of pressure who could make that decision, all of us should be able to think critically about our red lines and the risk of seduction, the risk of generating unpopular findings, the risk of politicians who may engage in pro-social lying, and how to avoid all those issues. In addition, after he left the Census Bureau, he founded his own polling company, and he writes about some of the ethical dilemmas he runs into conducting political polls, especially for political candidates. And in Colombia, as in the US, if you have a good polling rating, that's very helpful for you as a candidate. It can really launch your campaign. If you're not in the polls or you don't have good findings, that can be the end of your campaign. And so you can imagine the type of pressure that generates on a pollster to try to generate certain types of results for a candidate. And he made some difficult decisions, including to do less of that kind of political polling and do more types of survey research on development programs and other types of public policy issues. He also engaged in a process where he discussed with the members of his company in a very inclusive process, and in fact like a partnered process, how to navigate these types of ethical dilemmas. And so he kind of is an exemplar of how to deal with these issues, both kind of as a researcher, as a policymaker, in between.
Great. So finally, we have Leanne Erdberg Stedman's contribution, and there we have the Pentagon. She was a national security staffer under the Obama administration. Then she went on to work at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which was very unceremoniously closed recently. In any case, from her time on the National Security Council as a staffer, I really learned a lot from her contribution, because what she lets us know, some of our colleagues, and you can imagine this, they can be reluctant to engage with certain kinds of agencies, to advise the Department of Defense or to advise the CIA, because we sometimes feel that these agencies have been involved in nefarious activities. We don't, as researchers, necessarily want to support those activities. Leanne's perspective on this, though, is that if somebody from an intelligence collecting agency is contacting you about your research, it probably means they've already read your research. They already know quite a lot about the research you've done, the findings you've reached. Her point is, if they're asking you for a conversation, it kind of doesn't matter who's in power or what the agency is. You should probably go and have a conversation with them, because it's an opportunity for you as a researcher to contextualize your findings and to do some of the really important things that we've been talking about, conveying the complexity, explaining the methodology, being specific about the limits of the study, the conditions under which your findings apply, the conditions under which your findings probably don't apply, right? And so her urging to people like us, having seen it from the other side, is to really, at a minimum, be willing to have the conversation. It doesn't mean necessarily that you agree to do more research on their behalf, as Jay would tell us. Sometimes that does get you into unethical territory, but to have the conversation. And her other really critical point, as we've talked about with respect to Tricia Olson's chapter and the black box, is to be extremely curious about what the policy process is, where your interlocutors are in that decision-making process, so that you go in as fully informed as you can be about what your contribution is going to be. So, in the hopes it would be a productive contribution, not something counter to your norms. So, to wrap up, I don't know if we need to explain that we think science is in crisis. I mean, we are at a point in at least American trajectory where scientific agencies are being closed, staffs are being cut, grants are being canceled, and even about things that we would have thought 5 years ago would be politically uncontested. There's actually a funny anecdote that we refer to from a guy named Robert Pilkey, who was a professor at Boulder for a long time. He says, look, when you're a researcher engaging in research and these debates, there's abortion politics and there's tornado politics. You know going in that abortion politics is going to be politicized. Tornado politics, not so much. In today's world, tornado politics is very politicized, right? So we just want to close by saying we feel like with respect to scientific inquiry at this point, there is no safe place. And that is a big problem, right? If we want to have high quality policymaking and democratic quality, we somehow need to get to a different point in this conversation.
Do you want to say more about it?
No.
Okay. Fair enough.
It is 7:02.
There are times. So just to conclude, one of the things the book does, and I think probably the core contribution, is that it's giving advice for all of us. And part of this advice comes from our own encounters and missteps with these issues. And so we try to learn from our own, I don't want to say failures, but challenges we encountered, and try to generate advice that other professors can use, academic researchers, think tank researchers, students. So we're trying to, hopefully develop some training material for people across many different fields to be able to do a better job of anticipating ethical dilemmas and addressing them. And I think, we come out of social science, and I think this is, very important for social scientists. It's even important for just the so-called hard sciences. Okay. So hard sciences are very important. I think they run into these same dilemmas. If you're a physicist or an engineer, you have to think about these types of issues as well. And the technology that's on the sort of the tip of everyone's tongue today is AI. And a lot of those issues come up in that area as well. And so even though this is a book for social science, our hope and intention is that people across the sciences find it useful. And so really our advice is how to speak science to power. What should you do? And, just to sum up, one is conduct and share science for evidence-based policymaking. And so, science should be conducted thoughtfully, and should help ground decisions in evidence as opposed to ideology or some other types of influence that may not be based in good evidence. And then in addition, deciding when and how to share science to avoid misuse. And so, sometimes you should go ahead and share those findings. Sometimes maybe you shouldn't. We've talked about the issue of how you frame your results so that they're used appropriately. And this can be a very, big challenge for all of us to decide. And then, scientists are also pro-science activists. And this doesn't mean sort of supporting one viewpoint or another, but more supporting the collection of evidence and learning and using that evidence for good decisions. And so scientists have increasingly been advocates, and the idea there is not so much to take one side or another, but be on the side of education, learning, reflection. And then standing up to pressure to censor or alter findings. I mean, this is key. There's a lot of pressure right now to, maybe not use certain words, to not, research certain topics. And I think scientists should let the evidence guide them and let that guide them to answers, and be truthful and be honest about what you find. I think our students today are asking questions, like, should I work on this issue or that issue? And I think the answer is, you should let the evidence take you where it may. And then, I think more broadly, we need to reinforce science and science education. And I think this is sort of an invitation to everyone in the room and everyone watching that, this day and age, believing in science doesn't mean you have to, discard other beliefs as well, but it does mean that, we should allow evidence to guide us and encourage education and thoughtful reflection about the answers we have. So.
Yeah.
With that, thank you very much. I guess we'll turn over to Rachel for
No,
final words.
that's good.
Okay.
This is from John online. What do you do when policymakers don't want to be held accountable and take active steps to avoid critique and debate?
So, I'll jump into the fire there. So I think, if scientists have important results, whether it's a political science result or, a result from biology or chemistry or whatever it is, I think, part of the goal of science, which we actually kind of didn't touch on, but it's really to improve, to benefit the public good, to make our lives better, to have a better understanding of complex issues. And so I think it's incumbent upon scientists to try to share those results. And, I think, right now, the relevant audiences who may consume or be interested in those types of findings are shifting. But I think it's still important for scientists to share. And in some cases, that might mean finding new policy partners or policy audiences to engage with. So.
Yeah, I basically think, particularly in the current environment, people who know from an evidence point of view that we should be doing something different, we should be shouting from the rooftops. I think and I'd be happy to argue with anybody here who really wants to disagree, but I think a problem in the current Trump administration is that there are actually plenty of people in the administration and in the Republican Party who know that evidence is telling us to do things differently from what the president's impulses are telling him to do. And the problem for those people is looking at the way former members of the administration from 2016 through 2017 to 21, the way those people have been treated, the way their security details have been pulled, the way they've been denied access, the public attacks on those people, right? There is a real climate of fear that is preventing, I think, going to the question, is preventing the publication and the articulation of what we do know and what we, from an evidence point of view, what sound policy is. It doesn't matter if it's the economy or climate change or immigrant rights. The truth is just not making its way into the discourse because we are experiencing justifiably a climate of fear. And so what is the answer? That is, we can see it in the law firms, we can see it in the universities. There is a real collective action problem that these institutions and that we as members of the public have to get on top of immediately, right? If there is protection in unity and solidarity in these institutions, that makes them less vulnerable. If this administration feels like it can pick off institutions and individuals one by one, that's going to be a terrible problem. Many of us are going to go down. So I think, aside from being very loud about what the evidence says, we also need more of an organizational strategy of protecting each other in our pursuit of speaking science to power, of saying what the truth is, what we know, right? And I'm just very fearful, especially looking at the Republican Party, a party that I admire, enormously in its history, and with whom I have great agreement on some foreign policy with members of Congress today, including this guy, Don Bacon, who just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, right? He's my ally on Ukraine, and on Russia. But he's one of the few Republicans who's come out and said, the Trump administration's policy on Russia is completely antithetical to what this party has been standing for since the 40s, right? And so I think a much more aggressive civil society is critical.
Well, thank you. This is really fascinating. And this past weekend, many of us participated in a national protest. Those were citizens. If you were to insert the word citizen into speaking citizen science to power, what would that look like?
That's an interesting question. I think,
Yeah.
I think, one of them is as citizens being informed about the types of scientific research there is, and I think grappling with, the same types of issues that we're grappling with, like competing findings, competing results, and being informed about those issues so that you can be an effective local advocate on those issues, whether it's, the importance of vaccination right now with the measles outbreak, or the importance of, why, for example, a cause that I've worked a lot on is peace processes, and, why institutions like the U.S. Institute of Peace or other, pro-peace initiatives are not only effective, but they're cost effective, right? They're like, a much better way than, causing more wars. And so I think, now is a good time, I think, to, engage deeply with the issues that scientists are dealing with, and to use your voice to also support evidence-based decision-making.
Yeah, I also think that there's some really great research by a colleague of ours who used to work at the Korbel School. Her name is Erica Chenoweth. She's now at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And she's done a lot of work on social mobilization, peaceful social mobilization, and the enormous effect that protests like the ones that we participated on the weekend, in the service of science, of information, of really calling out what the truth is. According to her research, and this is controversial, but it actually takes a relatively small proportion of any given population to seriously destabilize a flawed regime. Right, so I'm also somebody who studied Eastern Europe, so I studied a lot of the social mobilization going on in what was then the Soviet space in the 1980s, and one of the areas that I think was most interesting in Eastern Germany, in the town of Leipzig, I don't know if any of you have been there, but they had the Monday night protests for a long time as communism was ending. And what happened over time, they had these scheduled Monday night protests, and each week they got bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And so the citizen scientist part of this, not just under this regime, but really under any, right? If you feel like people in positions of authority are ignoring evidence and ignoring the truth, to really resist in collective ways and send a message that way. And I'm enormously optimistic. I feel like if the East Germans and the Poles and the Czechs could do it, we can also do it in this country.
Right, I'll just maybe.
I'm Rachel Epstein.
The researcher you were just referencing.
Oh, her name is Erica Chenoweth, Chenoweth.
I was just going to say, in order to, have good conversations about science with our neighbors and community members. One of the things that probably doesn't work super well is like shaming people into, believing certain findings. And so I think, finding ways to have open conversations with people. And I think, one of the ways that I've been thinking about this issue is, that probably a point of commonality and encounter is just, the idea that, we all want better evidence. We all want to make better decisions in our personal lives. And we also, want our society to make decisions based on better evidence. And I think, sort of that evidentiary framing of it, sometimes science is viewed as a loaded term, but, hey, don't you want some better evidence of whether this works or not? I think is a helpful way of broaching that subject.
You mentioned AI, and we've had a few questions coming online about it. And I'll try to kind of lump them together, but you have an intuition on whether AI will be a force for good or evil? Will it be positive or negative in the context of quantifying, qualifying, understanding research output? So there were some questions about echo chambers and so on, but can AI help us find signal in the noise, or is it going to create noise?
I tend to be a techno-optimist. But I will admit, I haven't done research in this field, right? What I hear experts in AI saying is that deployed in the right way, it will be medically incredibly beneficial. It can help us figure out how to deploy technologies in an efficient way to address climate change. It has potentially enormous economic and educational benefits. One of the things that I'm very worried about is what happens to the labor force. Kind of life as we know it and working life as we know it could be on the edge of a very significant disruptive change, and that could be socially dislocating as well. Right? So I think the ethics around its handling and what Ollie and I are talking about in this book, even though we don't have a chapter on AI, for people to be thinking about the public good, about being transparent, about being self-reflexive, that's critical to a productive unfolding and evolution of this technology. I think we cannot escape the ethics and how difficult the ethics around this issue are.
I'll just make a few brief comments. I think, this, harkens back to the atomic bomb debates, in terms of a technology that obviously had a lot of good things with atomic energy. Well, there's some issues with atomic energy, but it's, also a clean one as once you deal with the byproducts. But also possibly very harmful. And, I think so far, my sense is AI can do a lot, but it still has a lot of limitations, and you get a lot of bad answers or hallucinations, as they're called, from these things. But in order to understand, science and information, it does present us with a very powerful search engine, so we can look things up. But I think it's still, important for all of us to verify and check those types of answers, and so we still need to be educated and thoughtful in terms of like consumers of that information and consumers of that science. I tend to be optimistic as well, and in fact, I'm running some human rights classes at the University of Denver right now, and in this class, it's on research methods, and one of the assignments I'm throwing at them is to build AIs for human rights. And so I have a limited experience with this, but I'm going to see how they do, and I'm going to learn from it, and I'll get back to you in 4 weeks or 8 weeks.
Thank you for your comments. I'm interested in going back to a situation like the source of COVID being in supposedly, perhaps being in China from the Wuhan laboratory. Mm-hmm. And given how the political debates occur, how the science debates occur, it seems to me that science is in a very difficult position, particularly in that case, because China won't let anybody have access. WHO sides with China. And a scientist has a hard time saying all, because they might say, oh, there's a 70% probability. Well, newspapers and politicians don't deal in those kind of terms. How do you bring the two of those together in order to get a better result than what we did get?
Before you answer, I'll just add a little extra color from online that's along the same lines. Language like margin of error or double blind means something to scientists and are interpreted very differently from the public through the media and policymakers. Have at it.
Yeah, I think this is really difficult and something that we struggle with in the manuscript, and something that when we think about responsible policy engagement among researchers, we're still struggling with, in the sense that most research has, even very robust results, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So we had a debate, did it start in the wet market? Did it start in the Wuhan lab? And I'm actually not sure what the state of play in that debate is at this point. Maybe you know, Dale. But I guess what I think is that as researchers, we need to, both vis-a-vis politicians and politicians vis-a-vis the public, need to be more upfront about the complexity and the uncertainty. I mean, that comes out in several of the chapters. It comes out in my chapter, it comes out in George's chapter. There may be other areas in which it's salient. But I think the relationship between political authorities and publics is such that we're not willing to spend, I think, the time required on these issues to embrace the complexity. And in a way, it probably comes back to how well-educated, thoughtful, and prepared are publics for the complexity of the world that they are either entering or in which they live. And, from my point of view, we should, I think, as researchers, as leaders, as political authorities, be trying to cultivate the sort of patience that's required to understand the complexity and to not settle for sound bites as policy. I really, if there's one thing that comes out of this project, we've talked to another colleague, Debbie Avant, about it as well. I mean, she's got a whole different research project going on extractive industries and how important it is to talk to the different stakeholders and communities about the trade-offs that they face, right? And I think we need a much more sophisticated debate about these issues, and it really starts with public engagement and interest, like you're showing tonight. I don't know if you have further thoughts on that.
Getting smart, getting educated on how science works, and just how acquiring good evidence works is important. And I think, sort of the message would be that, all of us should sort of be able to think like ethical experimentalists and just understand that, that basic kind of experimental process and what that can yield and what the limitations of that are. And so, like, for example, in my current human rights classes, we're also learning about impact evaluation. So how to understand whether a development program or a humanitarian program or a training program is effective or not. And one of the ways to do that is to run things like an experiment or to approximate an experiment. And I think, to the extent that people can sort of understand and realize that both the benefits and the limitations of those types of methodologies is helpful. And, I don't want to sound too scientific, but, a lot of us, we do this in our personal lives like every day. We try one thing and it doesn't work, and then we try another thing and see if that works better. And then this time it didn't work, I'm going to go back to the other thing until we sort of, work out these rules of thumbs and heuristics. And I think that's the type of language that most people can sort of recognize in their personal lives. And I think that's going to be a useful tool to help them interpret, well, what's the margin of error on a poll, right? Like you have polling results, and how can I, interpret whether this is accurate or not, or some other type of study about a scientific cure or treatment. And so that would be my thoughts on that.
It's a great question.
So in the academic sphere, is there a push from researchers and science advocates to try and impart these red lines and ethics into learning researchers, into students, to try and impart these things in as a part of the curriculum so that as they go into becoming researchers proper and contributing to research as students, are they considering these things? Are they being imparted with this mindset to think about their frameworks and think about their red lines and things like that?
I think it's getting better. So as we mentioned at the beginning, when this group of researchers got together in 2019, we were reflecting on the training that we had, and we were trained to do research, but we were not trained in how to communicate those findings to policymakers. You know, that was illustrative, I think, of how PhD programs were run. Then, as we mentioned in the book, another colleague of ours, Cullen Hendricks, did a bunch of research through surveys about how engaged international relations scholars are and how well prepared they feel they are. Okay, so his findings are lots of people try to be engaged in policy, very few people have formal training or mentoring in it. But this Carnegie Corporation support for bridging the gap and for responsible engagement has really changed the conversation. So I think there's much more awareness in classrooms like ours about the ethical responsibilities of practitioners. It doesn't matter if you're going out to be a researcher or a development worker or somewhere else, you know, a defense analyst. We at the Corbell School anyway, and I think across the professional schools that train people in international studies, are much more conscious than we were even a decade ago about how important infusing the curriculum with ethics is. I think that's happening.
I think so. I think, you know, the book is really the you know, our effort
Pushing the
to
book.
push that in the field. And so, you know, I think, you know, one of the things we've done is increased the number of trainings that we've been running, and we'll be doing a lot more of these with students from around the country and even around the world. And one of the things we found in some of the initial meetings we've had is that students and, you know, junior faculty, a lot of them are attuned to these kinds of issues, and they realize that either they're going to run into them or that they have run into them, and they're kind of searching for that type of advice. And so for me, I thought that it's very encouraging that they're that thoughtful and aware of it. And so I think there's an appetite for this kind of finding. I mean, I can just tell you, like in the same class I mentioned, like we are, you know, together talking through these issues, and I think I'll tell you at the end of the quarter, but I think that the students have been receptive to these ideas and feel like they're more prepared and sort of less anxious about conducting research with a policy organization or a government agency. And we in fact have a project that is one of those types of projects where we're working with government agencies to conduct research.
What do you feel the misuse of scientific research has been over the years, going back to the days of big tobacco, telling the public that it's safe to smoke, and then the tobacco companies getting into the food industry and providing the food we eat today, and companies like Monsanto? And it seems like sometimes the scientists don't have a red line, they have a green line, and they only see money.
Yeah.
And they reach foregone conclusions for these corporations that are paying them.
Yeah, I mean,
I told you it was all softballs here at the Vail Symposium.
We had one, but
I mean, I think it's a great example of all the examples that you just mentioned. I mean, you know more about those examples than I do. I can tell just by the way you articulate the question. Right, this is why I think what we said at the beginning about the separation and independence of scientific communities is critically important. And I know it doesn't seem like it at this minute, but in fact, government funding for research and the independence that has traditionally allowed many researchers is critically important to combat the relationship and the relationships that you're talking about. So on the way up, I mentioned this to James and Ollie. I was listening to the daily New York Times interview with the president of Princeton, and he was being asked by the interviewer, can't the private sector replace government funding for the research that your university currently uses? $250 million a year at Princeton. And as you would expect, the president said absolutely not. That the private sector relationships are too different, and researchers engaging in research on behalf of those corporations, they're not independent. They're not speaking science to power. They are beholden and, as you say, financially incentivized, right? So we need to have a system of incentives where the researcher is really interested in finding the truth, right? Getting the evidence, answering the question, and then society can, based on that evidence, make decisions about how they want to apportion resources or make policy, et cetera. So I think what you're pointing to is a terrible problem in the United States and in other countries. And one of the solutions that we've used is government funding to support independent scientific research. If we move away from that, we are in even deeper trouble than we have been as a consequence of the kinds of relationships that you just pointed out.
What she said.
Might be.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Oliver Kaplan and Rachel Epstein.
That's right. Oh, you want a high five?